bahagia, yaitu tentang reflections on using technology supported learning. Dan kini saatnya
kita akan mengundang moderator kita ya untuk bergabung bersama kita di atas panggung.
Dia?
Yakni Ibu Pratiwi. Dan sepertinya sudah tidak sabar lagi ya, baik yang di daring ataupun yang sudah bergabung secara luring nih ya.
Untuk kita menyapa Profesor Gary dari Manchester University. Iya, 1 jam waktunya Mbak Tiwi untuk memandu sepenuhnya sesi kedua ini. Dipersilakan.
Terima kasih.
Iya.
Baik, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan, Rahayu. Peace be upon us all. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and participants here at Pullman, Jakarta, Indonesia, and also online across Indonesia and everywhere in the world, perhaps. Good evening. I'm indeed delighted. Hi, Professor Gary. I'm indeed delighted to inform that there are over 500 participants who are present today, online and on-site. Thank you for joining us today in the Regional Symposium on Instructional Design and Technology 2022, or Simposium Regional Pengembang Teknologi Pembelajaran 2022. Welcome to the second session of the symposium with our special guest from Manchester, United Kingdom. But before I get into the introduction, allow me to remind you that this session will primarily be conducted in English. Therefore, kindly have the questions prepared in English for later in the Q&A segment. The timeline for this session is to be estimated around 1 hour with 30 minutes for the presentation and 30 minutes for Q&A segment. Thank you. So let us begin, shall we? Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and participants, it is an honor for me to have the opportunity moderating for our special speaker for today's evening session. Allow me to introduce Professor Gary Maduram to you all. Let's give a big round of applause to welcome him in the room. Welcome, Professor Gary, and good day to you, considering that it is still around noon there in Manchester, if I'm not mistaken. For your information, today, Professor Gary, we have 514 digital technology in education and the PG Cert in higher education. His main teaching focused on technology-supported learning with a particular interest in technology-supported language learning. His research interests teacher education at a distance with a more recent focus on using mobiles to support teacher education in low-resourced contexts. His most recent funded projects are a Grand Challenges Research Fund project on teacher professional development through practitioner research in Côte d'Ivoire, a project with adult ESOL teachers of refugees in Manchester developing materials for online delivery during the pandemic, a newly awarded project setting up an online resource and community of practice for teachers in India. He is also currently working for the British Council Sub-Saharan Africa team, managing a variety with teacher educators and teachers making use of tools like WhatsApp, Telegram, and Zoom. Let's have a closer look at his recent publication to understand more about his expertise. In 2022, he published his works on exploring the shaping of English language teacher practice while COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, language teaching in a time of pandemic, learning from volunteer experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, and a mixed method study of how instructor designed for learning in online and distance education. And in 2020, his publication centers around WhatsApp supported language teacher development, a case study in the Zatari refugee camp, and exploring mobile support for English language teachers in a context of conflict, Syrian refugee teachers in Jordan. Professor Gary, these are very impressive and interesting area of research. I'm glad that this can be shared with all of us here to be read further later on. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and participants, today or this evening, Professor Gary Madharan will present a topic that he has specifically prepared for all of us. It is about reflections on using technology-supported learning in challenging circumstances. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Gary Madharan. To Professor Gary Madharan, the room is yours, and you may start now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. How will we see the slides? How does that work? Okay, all right. So, yeah, so I'm going to, as has been said, and thank you very much for that nice introduction, and thank you for welcoming me to this conference. And I'm very pleased to be speaking here. And I hope you're having a great time, both face-to-face and online. So if you'd like to move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this work, as was suggested in the introduction, focuses around teaching in circumstances that are considered challenging. Development Goal 4, which has its sort of sub-target of 4C, which is looking at trying to increase the supply of qualified teachers. And, you know, that SDG goal is mainly sort of focused on issues of trying to develop learning outcomes for children in schools. But it also has this subsection of teacher education, and the Sustainable Development Goals recognize that teachers are vital in the work that they do in raising children's learning outcomes. So it's really important to focus on teachers. Now, one of the big problems that we face is that a lot of teachers in the world, and this is in many subject areas, but in my own specific area of English language teaching, often people go into teaching without very much training. I mean, it does vary considerably across the world, but certainly in a lot of the contexts that I've worked in the more recent years, people either have limited training or they don't have opportunities to develop their training beyond maybe the initial training course that they went on. So if we could have the next slide, please. Now, it might be difficult for you to read this, but we will focus in on this. So I was recently asked to do a panel discussion on for in the Americas. This is through the British Council, and they sent me a whole series of questions. And I thought, oh, well, okay, if I'm going to do this talk to Indonesia, I mean, it's very much related. I would focus on some of these questions, and I'm basically going to look at the first three questions, and we'll hone in on them. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think about those issues, and then obviously you can make comments in the question and answer. Originally, I did have some Mentimeter questions to interact with that, but the technology didn't allow me to do that. So if you could move on to the next slide. So the first question is, they asked me, could you speak a little bit about the kinds of strategies and technologies that you've found useful when it comes to helping learners and teachers? So this got me reflecting around issues to do with strategies particularly, and certainly in the work that I've done over the years, one of the things that I've become very conscious of is the particular context. Now, obviously, in any country, never mind in the different countries that I've worked in, you have a variety of contexts. I guess you will work in, some of you will work in large cities, perhaps like Jakarta. Some of you will work in smaller towns like Ujung Pandang, which I've actually been to. And some of you might work in very rural areas in small schools. And certainly the project that I read about in Adning's thesis was certainly reflected that kind of process, the fact that people are working in very different contexts. So strategies will depend on the context, and things obviously have changed over time. Second factor that we need obviously to consider is the learners. So age is an important factor. Also the type of school. I work in a context where you have both public and private schools, and private schools can mean a number of different things. So we often find ourselves talking about, I mean, if you talk about the private sector in the United Kingdom, that's very different from talking about the private sector in a country like India, for example, where often the private sector can mean schools run by non-governmental organizations, NGOs as we refer to them. And in Côte d'Ivoire, where I've done quite a lot of work over the last few years, the private sector is a sector that's growing, and it's growing partly because the central state, the Ministry of Education, doesn't have the finance to be able to develop its own new state schools, and partly because some people are unhappy about the state school system. But one of the features of that particular context is a lot of the teachers who work in the private sector, they're often teachers who work in the state school who do a second job or sometimes a third job to help them financially. So, the type of school is very important, and the quality of the school as well is also important. So these things make a difference. And teachers also are varied. They sit in at various stages in their career. And as I said, they're trained or not trained. In my context with language teaching, sometimes they have a very low language level. They don't really know their subject area very well. Gender plays a massive factor. I've mentioned the number of jobs, people's age, and so on. So beliefs about teaching and learning, and how much control they have within their schools, their agency, whether they're supported by the local management, local authorities, school inspectors. All of these kinds of people make a difference. So what a teacher does in their specific classroom is affected by a lot of factors. So the issues in terms of strategies really makes a difference. So next slide, please. So I found this when thinking about the issue of technologies. I found this list from this guy, Michael Trucano, who works at the World Bank, very helpful when I'm trying to select technology. And one of the biggest problems that you face, and Michael Trucano is very hard on this in some of the writing that he does, but it's true. So many times we try and introduce new technologies into context without really thinking about whether it's actually going to work very effectively. So, but the point that he makes at the beginning there is the best technology is the one you already have, know how to use and can afford. So that's really quite critical that, one of the things that I've always worked on in the work that I've done is to try and think about what sort of technologies are already out there rather than sort of, thinking, oh, we've got this wonderful new technology, let's try and introduce this into a new context. Another point there, again, if we come back to the Sustainable Development Goal 4, you see a point 3 there, treat teachers like the problem, and they will be. So teachers are often seen as the problem rather than actually asking teachers what they need, what their experiences are, what technologies they have, and so on and so forth. Another thing that's often forgotten about is the content. When technology supported learning is introduced into different contexts, it's often introduced, technology is provided, let's say a tablet or something like that. Computers in the past, old-fashioned sort of desktop computers, they were just introduced, but there was nothing to do with them. And a final point, I think I'll won't go through the whole list. So number 8 there, put sustainability first. So if you're thinking about running a project with a piece of technology, you've got to think of, well, is it going to continue after I've introduced this particular technology? When I walk away from this project, I think it's going to carry on working. So that's a very useful list, and I think it sort of helps to underpin the thinking that when I think about technologies. Can we have the next slide, please? So a second question then was about the pandemic. Because I think all as technologists, we became kind of clear that there was a difference that the pandemic made. It had all sorts of negative aspects in terms of people like ourselves who are learning technologists. It made a significant difference to our understanding and our use of technology. But still, we face a situation. What have we learned from that? And I think we learned that we needed to be ready for things like the pandemic, and we need to be ready for issues like climate change. The idea is that somehow, we're kind of ready for the next pandemic, but we're not really. We need we need to think about, a response plan. We need to invest in the way that teachers are trained. So one of the clear things that came out from the working in the context of the pandemic, that yes, teachers did cope in many cases, but they would have coped so much better if they'd have had some form of pre-training. And of course, now we've moved back to a world where we have, we're back in regular school teaching and regular university work in most parts of the world, not everywhere, but in most parts of the world. We've kind of, we're beginning to forget that, but still, it's important to think about the way that we get teachers to engage in that, the sort of content that needs to be provided. So these are important issues to think about, and there are several reports mentioned there. And if you want to follow them up, I don't know how you'll get access to the references, but there are references at the end. So next slide, please. Other things that we learned that I think that were important was that we had issues in terms of equity, or we didn't have equity when it came to device use. So if we're going to think about using technology in learning or in teacher education, we have to think about how best to provide people with the sorts of technologies that we're interested in. And another thing that was also important is then when you think about special educational needs, for example, and providing particular facilities for people with special educational needs. So, for example, like subtitles, they actually impact generally on the kinds of ways that everybody can cope with it. So I don't know whether you're able to see the subtitles here, but the idea would be that, that if you provide those subtitles, maybe people, they're initially provided for people who perhaps are hearing impaired, but they're also able to support the kinds of people who kind of could do with support with reading. So there are lots of issues that we learned that. So attitudes and approaches towards technology use. So generally, I think it's generally understood that actually attitudes became more positive towards technology and the use of technology to support learning in schools and in universities. And if you look at, there's an EduCause report that came out quite recently, is published in 2022, that learners, even if teachers don't want to do that, learners want flexibility. They also want social interaction and academic engagement. So those sorts of things are important. So even if we've moved back to a point of not relying exclusively on technology to provide learning, people still want that. They want the flexibility that technology provides, so that blended notion. But the thing that we learned was that social action, interaction is also very important. So the idea of having a more blended approach is something that is important, but still, again, also is that notion of content. So next slide, please. So I won't dwell on this. There's a lot of information on here, but this just is a slide that sort of shows some of the projects that I've worked on recently. Some of them were mentioned in the introduction. But a lot of this work developed out of an initial project that I did in Pakistan. But it's gone on to work that I did in India, and particularly work that I've been doing for the last several years in sub-Saharan Africa, so countries like Cote d'Ivoire or Senegal, or now I'm working in places like Ethiopia and Sudan. So next slide, please. So one of the things that came out, the original Pakistan project used a tool that maybe some people in the audience don't recognize, a tool called Skype, or maybe everybody remembers Skype, but nobody uses it anymore. But this was the local tool that was suggested by the Ministry of Education, and we started off using Skype in the same way that we're using Zoom to broadcast to large numbers of people. And this was very novel at that time. And we also used PowerPoint in the way that we're using PowerPoint here as a kind of way of managing the process. But one of the things that we started experimenting with was mobile phones. And mobile phones were quite low tech then. They weren't the smartphones. We're talking about either feature phones, as we would refer to them, phones that basically you had a little screen on, but they didn't have much feature. So we were using text to exchange. Now, at the same time, if you go to the next slide, I was doing some work in India, and we were collecting a set of case studies about different practice within Indian, not just schools, but in colleges, in universities, in formal and formal education. And one of the groups was a WhatsApp community of physics teachers. Now, the area where these teachers worked was a very dispersed area, and they set up this WhatsApp community to actually do the sort of things that we were trying to do in Pakistan. So I picked up on this idea. and I moved this into the work that I did in Jordan. So if you move to the next slide. So we worked, the first project that I used WhatsApp on was with teachers who are refugees in Jordan. And one of the things that was quite difficult there was the actual access. So these guys were living in a refugee camp, and the clear problem that they had was with access to actually being able to use this technology, even though it's a fairly basic technology. And we also really, I realized at the time that the WhatsApp independently wasn't going to work. So we tried also to introduce Zoom into that process as well. And what came out of that and what fed into other projects was that idea of providing additional resource in terms of access, so that the teachers who live in difficult circumstances, who live in remote contexts, can actually use their mobile phones in a meaningful way. So if you move to the next slide. Okay, so this was a project we conducted in Côte d'Ivoire. And again, I won't focus on a lot of the detail of this, but one of the things, if you look at point 3, we were trying to continue to evaluate the role of social media and facilitating communities of practice. So I know you've worked on issues around communities of practice in your own work in Indonesia. So that idea of establishing communities was important to us. So if you move on to the next slide. So this took up the ideas that we wanted a more blended approach. So we were doing sort of blended approaches at that time. So this was pre-pandemic. We were supposed to be going on 3 or 4 visits to this particular small town where there are a number of schools and doing work. And you can see some of the activity that went on. So next slide. So, but even so, we had some remote work. So it's probably very difficult to see this, but in the top right-hand corner, there were people who were remote. There were people who were sitting in Manchester and who were communicating, doing part of the session alongside the people who were in the particular sort of small town where we sat, where we were running the seminar. Next slide. But the pandemic intervened, and it meant that we had to move online. Now, this was a context where, although WhatsApp we used WhatsApp as part of this, it wasn't that easy to get the teachers to make use of WhatsApp, because the particular context and maybe their beliefs about the role of the tools wasn't in tune with the kind of things that we were doing. So we ended up mostly using Zoom, in fact. So we use Zoom in a variety of different ways. So if you look at the next slide. So as well as larger group, we also worked with very small groups. Now, there were 2 or 3, even though you see me on the left-hand side and somebody else, that represented 3 or 4 teachers. So what they would do is they would connect with one phone, they would sit in a classroom together, and they would communicate with me. So we use this as a way of providing mentoring. And if you see in the right-hand side, as well as me, there was also a local teacher or a local teacher developer. So Apia Kuadio on the left there was actually the head of the teacher development unit in the Ministry of Education in Côte d'Ivoire. So we were working with local mentors. So there was a mixture of things going on. So the idea of using technology that we had was as a support mechanism. So as well as running a WhatsApp group, which eventually, if you move on to the next slide, eventually, if you skip that one, I'll come back to that later if people are interested. As well as using, the tools like WhatsApp and Zoom, we realized that we needed local people to liaise with. So, there was a lot of collaboration between ourselves in Manchester and the people, the teacher developers who were working in the local context. So it was a very multifaceted approach. So we were using Zoom, but Zoom was not being used in the way that we're using it today. It was used for small group work. We used WhatsApp. WhatsApp ended up being used for management purposes. And we also made quite a lot of use of Padlet. We realized that Padlet, which I'm not sure whether you'll know what Padlet is, but essentially it's a kind of display tool. We were using Padlet as a kind of virtual learning environment. So materials were being presented on Padlet, partly because we realized that in WhatsApp, where we initially tried to present the materials, they kind of disappear. They scroll up the screen, and then you end up not being able to see them anymore. And if you see there some of the feedback here, this was a particular way of teaching. We used a kind of action research. It isn't called action research, it's called inquiry-based practice, but we used a mechanism to get the teachers to investigate their own classroom. So this was some of the sort of positive feedback we had from them. So if you move on to the next slide. So, there were some issues with this project, but they weren't that insurmountable. But we did find that, some of the initial ideas we'd had about WhatsApp weren't necessarily working in the way we wanted. So this was something, that this was my original proposal. This was something that I was really keen on, but I kind of realized that you kind of needed a tool like Zoom to actually support that. And in fact, Zoom took over as essentially a way of making that work. So if you move on to the next slide. So I then went on to actually, I was invited by the British Council to do a bit of a report on this kind of practice. So if you skip this slide, and rather than, we developed a questionnaire, or I developed a questionnaire, you probably can't see that, but we got responses from a lot of countries. There were particular kind of countries that where you get more response than others. So India there in the middle, and Mali in sub-Saharan Africa. That was partly because of my contacts there, and partly because people were involved in the project. So we managed to get quite a lot of data from a lot of different contexts about this use of different kinds of social media to work in this distance way with groups of teachers. So next slide. And we found some. I mean, in a way, the findings we got supported a lot of the ideas that have been worked on in other contexts. So if you look at that top bullet point, there's no other support for these teachers. So a lot of these teachers don't get any other support. So if they have a mobile phone and can use WhatsApp and other kinds of tools, then this is a possibility for actually working with them in this kind of way. So you get a situation where a lot of ideas and materials are shared. You can have training sessions. And when training sessions are actually run, they're valued. People like them. They take the ideas. They might not contribute. So one of the big issues with WhatsApp communities of practice, or Telegram communities of practice, or whatever other tool you're thinking of using, is that you don't necessarily get as much interaction as you'd like. So it's often dominated by a few people. But what this data showed was that even if they don't contribute, they're often reading the material, they're taking that material, they're using it in their classes, and they may make occasional contributions. And this, these groups provide, both a pedagogical but also a psychosocial support. So one of the things we learned in the pandemic very strongly was that teaching's not. It's not just about the content content's obviously important. It's not about developing knowledge. It's also about the emotional support that is actually happening between the teachers and the learners, but between other teachers. So teachers are often very isolated in the kinds of contexts I work in. They're very isolated. They don't necessarily have that much contact with other teachers. And here they've got a community that they can work with, who will respond to their question about, well, I can't work out how to teach this. How am I going to do that? And that goes way back to those physics teachers I mentioned in India, and that's exactly what they were doing. So they were actually engaging with the physics curriculum. They were swapping materials and so on. So there was quite a lot of evidence that came out of this survey that the sort of tools that I've been advocating for quite a long time by then were actually working in all sorts of ways. And right at the bottom there, it's very difficult to capture it, but there is some evidence that the kinds of groups that we're talking about actually impact on learner outcomes. And that's something that needs more work, how to get yourselves into a situation where you can do a study that really does sort of show sort of impact on learner outcomes. But there was a certain amount of evidence that's happening. So next slide. So, I mean, from my perspective, if going back to this sort of set of questions that I asked, where I was asked to reflect on, the ideas was I wasn't asked by those questions, but there was a group of questions. But it got me to reflecting on those issues over time. And if I'm going to work in a particular context, picking a particular tool to do a certain job with, and as I say, I've been working on this for quite some time now, you can use these tools in all sorts of ways. I mean, there are also people talk about all sorts of other things, but these tools can be used. So it's possible to run teacher development sessions in low resource contexts, using technology, but hopefully there's some kind of local mentoring as well. Now that might just be within school groups. So in the project that we ran in Côte d'Ivoire, there were several schools within the locality, and each of those schools had a number of English teachers in them. So it was possible to set up school-based support groups. But the other area that we've made a lot of use of is teacher associations. So they're particularly important in English language teaching, and they don't necessarily exist in other subject areas, but people who are involved in those teacher associations are also quite keen in developing those ideas. But at the same time, the ministries of education have also picked up on these ideas and realized that they can add value, or they can use these kinds of processes to add value to their teacher development in a variety of different ways. And this can be done in cost-effective ways. So in cash-strapped environments where there's very limited funding, then these are possibilities. You do need some funding to do this. So to make the thing equitable, there are people who don't have the funding to be able to even to do the basic access that we're talking about with relatively modest tools. So if you want this kind of thing to work, you have to find some funding. So social media was the focus that I was particularly interested in. But they are very powerful tools, but they have their limitations. I mean, I'm currently making use of Telegram rather than WhatsApp, and actually Telegram has a lot more facilities built into it that make it sort of more powerful in what you can do. But still, it has that basic sort of problem that it scrolls up the screen, and you have to keep reminding people to scroll back. So adding other sort of synchronous. So in the project that I work on at the moment with the Sub-Saharan African team in the British Council, we have monthly webinars, and there are also other kinds of webinars that go on. and the Telegram group that I work in is used as a way of wrapping around ideas as well as putting input in. We don't necessarily, have to accept that, but we can try and make a difference. But groups are going to be unbalanced. So not everybody's going to contribute, and we have to accept that. But the evidence from the survey that I did seems to suggest that even if people don't contribute, a lot of people are taking something from it. So there are almost 1,900 people on this particular group that I'm working in on the moment. And one of the reasons why people want to use Telegram is because you can have bigger groups. But if all 1,900 people contributed all the time, that really would be quite problematic. And just to reiterate, for projects to be sustainable, they need to start where teachers are, not where you want them to be. So you may have a bright idea, and I guess I might have had a bright idea a few years ago about using social media in this kind of way. But, still, I spent quite a lot of time actually doing background research to see whether actually how many people do have mobile, how many people have the internet access, and how many people are familiar with WhatsApp. So before I started using the tools in Jordan, which is where I began the experiment, I checked that people had access to it. And keep in mind all the time, teacher time. So one of the things that came out of the survey was that teacher time is limited. Already there are lots of issues that teachers face. Gender is also a significant issue. If you can avoid new toys, and if you can provide some data for your participants so that they can equitably access the materials or the activity that you're running. So I think that there are a bunch of references there that you can follow up. So I did put in at the beginning, I put in a link to a Google version of these slides. So I put quite a lot of information that are actually on the slides. I'll put it in again, so I don't know whether people can access that or how this material is shared. It's not the workbook. The workbook is something a bit different. So you've gone back to that. So I put it in the chat, whether people can actually see the chat. But there are a set of slides that you can access. So maybe somebody at the conference can distribute that around. So if people want to follow it up and look at the references, they can do. So that's basically the presentation over.
Applause for Professor Gary. Quite frankly, Professor Gary, it's such an incredible presentation. Thank you for sharing it with us today. And it is time now for our Q&A segment. But first, we'd like to apologize in advance as it is impossible to have all of the questions answered, but hopefully we can cover it all. The questions both online and on-site, through Slido, if I'm not mistaken. And there are currently 4 questions at the moment, 2 from our audience here and 2 are from the Slido. Okay, we are going to do this up until our 30 minutes timeline is up. So let's just proceed. The first question let's just get from the audience first, okay? Who wants to pose the first question from our audience here? Please stand up and mention your name. Who gets first? Okay. You can stand up, mention your name, and then right away to the questions to Professor Gary. Please, thank you. The mic, please.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dewi, giving me time to question and answer with Professor Gary. Hi, Mr. Giri. I'm Karnadi. K-R-N-A-D-I, Karnadi. Single name. King Karnadi. That's a good name. Thank you, Mr. Purwanto. Considering the Indonesian right now, so we face the problems, with pasca pandemic, right?
Pandemic, yeah.
After pandemic, so we have many problems, including the rural areas. So you never talk about the nation problems, right? Since your first presentation, the initiation, right? You never mentioned Indonesia, right? So you have report on Indonesia's problems, facing pandemic problems, especially in education. Do you have a report on the research about the nations? This is the first question. The second one is, the technology. Many people, the technology is considered as a tools, right? Is high tech, right? So we never think that sometimes we should think that the technology is like a steps to do something, right? It's the best practice to do something where forget for a while the high tech, right? So how do you explain the solve problem in education, especially in rural area? They don't have high tech, right? They don't have access to the internet. So I think it's a good idea from you about this situation. Thank you very much, Mr. V.
Yeah. Thank you, Pak Karnadi or Mr. Karnadi or King Karnadi. So if you, Professor Gary, if you don't quite catch the real, the question from him is that the first, can I repeat it for one more time? The first is, do you happen to have any information about the research, the similar research that you are conducting in other countries to Indonesia, or do you have any plan to do research in Indonesia? And the second is, what is your idea about overcoming challenges in the rural areas regarding the technology?
Yeah, well, they're very big questions. I mean, I would think I would recommend, people read Dr. Adning's thesis. So the person who invited me to do this talk, I was his examiner. So, he's done an excellent thesis there where he talks about exactly these kinds of issues in Indonesia. So that would be a great place to start. So maybe you should share that, or if he's now sort of actually got some articles out based on his thesis, I think they would be a very useful place to start. Or maybe ask him to do a presentation. I don't know whether he's doing one at the conference, but if he is about his work, then get along to it. So, I mean, were people replied on the survey that I did from Southeast Asia. I can't remember specifically. I won't say there were people from Indonesia because I can't remember off the top of my head. I should have checked that and anticipated this question. I mean, I'm agnostic about where I work. I mean, I've worked in places, all sorts of places in the world, over my career. But the most of the work that I've done around the use of tools like WhatsApp and Telegram has been in Africa, because that's where I've been asked to work. But I don't see any reason to sort of kind of move on to the second question, where the practices that we've engaged in cannot be used in rural areas. The project that we ran in several of the projects we ran in Côte d'Ivoire were based around rural areas, and my contention is that we can't necessarily make use of these tools directly in schools, which is what people sort of tend to sort of think about it. We can make use of them with teachers. So the point of these communities practice, as they're often referred to, is that it's supporting teachers to be able to do things. That doesn't mean that the actual delivery into the classrooms necessarily involves the use of technology, because the children don't have access to it, or in many cases there won't be electricity in schools. So obviously you've got battery powered phones that that enables you to do that. But it's looking at ways that you might use a technology that teachers have. But at the same time, a lot of the presentations and ideas that I've been engaged with look at alternative ways. So there's a lot of interesting work that was done in Mexico during the pandemic. So at this exchange of ideas that I was asked to deal with these questions at initially, that they were talking about how teachers got materials. They used the internet themselves to find materials, and then they distributed those materials. That material was printed out. They talked about things like, in the local area, when the schools were closed, the teacher would go round, would leave materials in the local shops. The children would collect the material from the local shop. They would engage with that material, and then the teacher would collect it, the following day or later on in the week. So, I'm not necessarily somebody who would advocate. I mean, it would be fantastic if everybody had equal access to technology, but they don't. Another area that is often ignored, but is again talked about, certainly in the context of Africa, but also in Americas, and I guess in other parts of the world, is the use of radio. So people often don't think about what might be considered sort of the lower tech forms, or forms that are more traditional as a way of providing education. So, there are opportunities for doing that kind of thing in a variety of ways. So one of the teachers who I work with on in the Telegram group that I've mentioned a couple of times, he also creates podcasts. So podcasts can be created again online, but they can be downloaded onto SD cards, so that SD cards can be distributed to teachers. Teachers can load that material onto their phones and again interact with it. So there are lots of possibilities, but they don't have to involve high tech. But my argument has always been that in most of the contexts that I visited, teachers do have some form of access to mobile phones, and I sat for Indonesia as well, and that was based in a pretty rural area. If he's in the audience, he might like to comment on that.
Okay, thank you so much for the elaborated answer. Does that answer your question, Pak Karnadi? Okay, but I can assure you, Professor Gary, for the Dr. Atning will present his research results. Correctly? Okay. So for fairness,
good.
One question from the audience already, and we are going to take one question from the Slido, if you don't mind. Okay. Okay. This is from Steve Iakanado. He's asking about what are the tricks or strategies in teaching using the latest learning technology to teachers who are already constrained by age. So this might a little bit interesting for you, please.
Well, I mean, you might argue that I'm constrained by age, but because I'm sort of in my 60s, so I seem to be able to use high tech technologies, but I guess you would argue that that's something I started learning as much younger. But yeah, I mean, age is a problem, and when you have older teachers who are less inclined to use technologies, it's difficult. But the same way that you have mentorship with between, older, more experienced teachers and younger, less experienced teachers, it can work the other way. So you can certainly think about sort of creative matching together, maybe for experienced teachers who help the younger teachers with their pedagogy and practice and classroom management and this kind of thing. But at the same time, that those younger teachers can support and mentor the older teachers. So it becomes more of a two-way process in terms of their use of the digital. And I think, we all have young people in our lives. Old teachers have young people lives. We're teachers, but I relied quite a lot on my own children for years, not to introduce me to new things, but also in terms of, sessions that I've run. So I think that interchange, that kind of intergenerational that advocate almost as a top can contribute in that kind of way. The other thing that tends to happen is that that people have strong about the way that teaching be done. So again, actually trying to work with people on different projects that are very much subject-based. And one of the problems with introduction of technology into any kind of education is it tends to be very generic. So rather than actually focusing on a particular context, which is what I tried to say, looking at, what is really here, and how can we get people to do things? And again, going back to that idea of, start with where people are. So instead of trying to introduce people to things that they're just not familiar with, start with things that they're already using. So, if somebody, is interested in, say, for example, using audio material in their teaching, that's a way in. It's a way into doing things. Or in my own context, in the teaching of languages, for example, these days people very seldom use more traditional ways of writing. So handwriting, things like that is taught, but as you get through the educational system, then people to use technologies for writing and that kind of stuff. So, and clearly older people are also involved in that as well. They might not be texters, but maybe they're using word processing tools and other things. So instead of using the traditional word processing tools like Word, you might introduce them to Google. And then Google Docs allows you to interact with it. It allows you to have a conversation with the student. So it's being creative in what you do. It's looking looking at where these people are and what are the resistance points. Why won't people kind of use that thing? But it's also finding ways into it. So as I say, through sort of mentoring and exchange of ideas. Did that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. I hope that answer the question from Pak Steve in Manado. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Professor Gary. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that because of the time constraint, actually to take all of the questions that is possible to be posed, right? But because of the constraints, I do apologize. That's okay. We need to end the session, the Q&A session. And I thank you all who have posed all of the questions, and your enthusiasm is highly appreciated. Thank you to Sir Gary Madorem. But before we say goodbye, if I may say, your insightful and eye-opening presentation that is based on your expertise, experience, and projects has provided us further knowledge, understanding about reflections on using technology learning in challenging circumstances. There are three closing points that I can capture from your presentation. First is there are still challenges faced by teachers who work in a difficult situation, where some of these challenges have increased the use of mobile phones and mobile-based communication tools or applications such as WhatsApp. And the second, the role of group learning, although vary, is significant, be it in the form of learning support, both pedagogically and psychosocially, meaning emotionally as well, idea sharing, and influence on the learner's outcome. And the third, one of the most important things emerging from the impact of COVID-19 pandemic to learning and education is building resilience, which makes it a crucial reminder, no matter what the hit of COVID-19 pandemic have been, the power of sharing in the creative process of overcoming challenges can be the driving factor for innovation that is uniquely inspired in a way we have never thought possible. So that's all today, ladies and gentlemen. Let's give a big round of applause once again for Professor Gary Maduram. Thank you, Professor. Goodbye, Professor Gary. You may leave the room now. Thank you, and until next time. Baik, terima kasih Bapak Ibu sekalian sudah mengikuti sesi ini dengan incredible. Semoga apa yang sudah di-sharingkan Profesor Gary tadi dapat menjadi berkah ilmu, kebaikan, dan manfaat bagi kita semua. Amin ya robbal alamin. Mohon maaf untuk segala kekurangan saya selama memoderatori sesi ini. Terima kasih. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Iya baik, boleh dong berikan tepuk tangan yang meriah sekali lagi. Ya.
Untuk paparan sesi kedua ini ya.
Betul sekali Mbak Susan, untuk moderator dan serta narasumber kita ya, yang sudah menambah pengetahuan kita di sesi paparan yang kedua. Semoga yang sudah disampaikan oleh Profesor Gary tadi dapat membuat kita gitu kembali mengisi bejana pengetahuan kita tentang penggunaan teknologi untuk pembelajaran di situasi yang menantang saat ini.
Oke, dan ini harinya semakin malam ya. Di belakang sudah ada kudapan yang sediakan Bapak Ibu. Jadi untuk sesi sudah ini bisa Bapak Ibu sambil ini ya
menikmati yang disediakan.
Iya, teh dan kopi serta makanan kecil yang sudah disediakan. Dan agar Bapak Ibu yang ada di ruangan ini maupun yang hadir secara daring itu nggak ngantuk ya, tetap semangatnya on.
Soalnya sudah terlihat kayaknya matanya mulai kecil gitu ya.
Iya ini, yuk kita bikin yel-yel ya Bapak Ibu ya. Kita bikin yel-yel untuk menyemangati simposium kita ini. Yel-yelnya adalah PTP Indonesia siap sukseskan transformasi digital.
Oke, iya. Boleh mungkin kita coba dulu nih ya Mbak ya.
Iya, tepuk tangan, ayo coba. Iya. Oke. Jadi nanti kalau saya atau Mas Hafizin bilang PTP Indonesia, Bapak Ibu akan mengucapkan
siap sukseskan transformasi digital.
Ya, kita latihan ya Bapak Ibu ya. Siap ya. PTP Indonesia luar biasa, tapi masih kurang kompak.
Oke, kita coba lagi nih.
Kita coba lagi yuk. PTP Indonesia bagus sekali.
Boleh dong tepuk tangan untuk kita semua. Iya. Oke nih, Mbak Susan. Supaya nih ya, Bapak dan Ibu yang berada di dalam ruang ini semakin melek gitu ya. Nah, kita akan coba nih untuk memutar roda keberuntungan kembali ya.
Yuhu, teriakan semangatnya mana Bapak Ibu, keberuntungan Anda akan ditampilkan lagi di layar.
Iya, bagi Bapak dan Ibu yang saat ini ya, teman-teman masih berada di luar gitu ya, tolong diinformasikan untuk kembali kan.
Iya.
Apabila nanti namanya muncul gitu ya Mbak ya.
Dan tidak hadir,
maka
hangus, betul, gitu ya.
Ya udah kalau gitu saya nggak kasih tahu deh biar saya dapat. Gitu.
Harapannya itu langsung bilang ke sebelah, kamu nggak pengen ke toilet? Salah sebentar, gitu ya, nggak usah kembali lagi. Ya. Oke, nggak gitu ya.
Baik, kita akan memutarkan dua ya.
Dua hadiah.
Dua hadiah ya.
Untuk dua peserta yang itu, ya. Baik. Oke, di layar videotron kita hitung.
Oke, boleh.
Sama-sama.
3, 2, 1,
putar. Siapa yang akan beruntung? Stop, berhenti. Sangat manjur rupanya ya.
Masya Allah ini doanya.
Ini doanya
luar biasa
manjur
nih, Pak.
sekali. Oke, Pak Siamta jangan
Dijawab.
malu-malu. Silakan
Boleh
langsung ke meja
Meja
panitia.
panitia, Pak.
Enggak, titip doa ke Pak Siamta, Pak. Ya. Selamat untuk Pak Siamta sudah mendapat hadiah keberuntungan yang
Keberuntungan, ya.
keempat ini ya.
Betul sekali. Boleh kita lanjut ya ke
Lanjut.
putaran kedua nih ya Bapak Ibu ya.
Oke.
Kita hitung di hitungan
3, 2, 1, putar. Stop. Siapa ya? Ya, selamat
yang
kepada
terbaik
Ibu
Hayati.
Hayati SPDM MP.
Ada?
Lambaikan tangannya. Oke.
Baik.
Silakan Ibu.
Selamat kepada Ibu Nur Hayati yang telah mendapatkan hadiah ya
Luar
dari roda
biasa.
keberuntungan ini.
Betul sekali. Ya, 2 hadiah sudah kita rilis ini Mas Hafid ya.
Iya.
Kayaknya sudah mulai on lagi ini.
Bismillah ya, semakin fokus nih ya Mbak ya
Semakin
malam ini ya.
fokus. Gimana kalau kita coba lagi untuk yel-yel ya? Saya penasaran ini.
Boleh,
Sudah
barangkali
dapat hadiah?
lebih semangat dari yang tadi ya?
Lebih semangat ya. Siap ya Bapak Ibu ya, yel-yel kita ya. Kalau ada yang mau menciptakan gerakan juga nggak apa-apa loh ya. Nanti urus ini ya. Kita coba. PTP Indonesia. Iya. Yang meja belakang tepuk tangan untuk meja belakang. Meja belakang tengah itu belakang tapi malah ternyata paling fokus.
Paling fokus. Kayaknya masih kaget nih Mbak.
Yang sayap kami gimana ini sayap kanan? Jangan mau kalah ya. Kita ulangi. PT Indonesia. Luar biasa. Iya, tapi dari yang kiri diem.
Wah.
Yang kiri langsung anteng gitu loh. Ya, toh kita harus memberi kesempatan kepada
Pak
tim
Purwo
kiri.
udah siaga nih kayaknya. Oke.
Oke,
Ini udah siaga nih.
sayap kiri kami berarti kanan ya.
Iya.
Iya, PTP Indonesia. Yes,
Boleh tepuk tangan.
luar biasa. Baik, Bapak Ibu sudah siap ya kita ya
Iya,
untuk
sudah.
memasuki sesi paparan.
Namun nih Mbak Susan, sebelum
Iya.
kita memasuki sesi paparan yang ketiga nih tentang kebijakan transformasi digital untuk pengembangan karir ASN,
Iya.
kami akan mengundang partisipasi aktif Bapak dan Ibu dengan mengakses menti.co
Iya,
yang
masih ingat
tampil
ya.
di depan ya.
Pertanyaannya,
Dengan pertanyaannya apa Mbak Susan?
dalam konteks transformasi digital, menurut PT, kebijakan apa yang diperlukan untuk pengembangan karir ASN di era transformasi digital? Jadi kebijakan apa sih yang diperlukan oleh kita-kita ini ya untuk pengembangan karir di era transformasi digital? Silakan langsung mengakses menti.com dan isikan kodenya yaitu
66812799.
Oke. Langsung diakses ya Bapak Ibu ya dan langsung berpendapat di situ.
Oke.
Baik.
Dan pastinya juga ini ya Mbak ya. Untuk pertanyaan ini jawabannya akan
Disampaikan.
bervariasi juga ya
Oh,
dari
iya.
setiap individu gitu. Isi
Sekali.
pertanyaan yang ada di dalam ini.
Dan ini kita sudah saatnya ya.
Betul sekali.
Sambil apa?
Sambil mengisi kita
Sambil
panggil nih
mengisi.
moderator kita yang saat ini sudah siap ya untuk bergabung bersama kita di atas panggung. Siapakah tuh?
Iya. Kita undang sama moderator kita Ibu yang sangat cantik ini yaitu Ibu Inanda Mora SHMSI untuk bergabung bersama-sama dengan kami di panggung ini. Silahkan. Ibu Inanda Mora ini sapa akrabnya siapa Bapak Ibu?
Mulai ngarang nih,
Siapa?
mau mulai ngarang.
Iya, biasa apa dengan Mbak Nanda. Selamat malam Mbak Nanda. Bisa
Malam,
di sini,
Mbak
di sini
Susan.
silahkan.
Sebelah kiri.
Iya. Semangat ya Mbak ya,
Semangat.
melihat wajah-wajah mereka. yang
Betul,
sangat
karena
luar
para
biasa.
PT-persnya masih semangat juga ya Mbak Susan.
Betul, soalnya masih
Meskipun
banyak
di ruang sebelah lagi seru ya kayaknya dia lawan Jepang.
Iya.
Tapi di
Menang
sini
siapa,
kita
Mbak?
juga masih seri kok.
Menang
Tenang,
siapa kira-kira?
tenang gak usah buru-buru
Jangan
untuk
sampai
beranjak
terpecah
dari
Bapak
sini
Ibu
ya. Karena di sebelah sana masih kosong-kosong.
Oh Oh iya, menenteramkan informasi dari Mbak Nanda ini ya. Baik. Jadi nanti Bapak Ibu tetap fokus karena Mbak Nanda akan memandu sesi paparan yang ketiga ini selama 12 jam.
Nggak sanggup saya Mbak.
Oh, nggak sanggup.
Harus bobo abis ini.
Oh iya, baik. Ya, hari ini saya diskon khusus untuk Mbak Nanda 1 jam saja cukup ya.
Oke, baik, terima kasih.
Dipersilakan.
Terima kasih Mbak Susan dan Mas Hafiz. Saya Inanda Mora akan memandu Bapak Ibu kurang lebih 1 jam ke depan di yang terakhir malam hari ini untuk acara Simposium Jabatan Fungsional Pengembang Teknologi Pembelajaran. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat malam. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Terima kasih teman-teman masih semangat sampai malam hari ini berkumpul di ruang ballroom kita ini menyaksikan sesi terakhir kita. Pada malam hari ini sudah hadir di tengah-tengah kita Bapak Dr. Insinyur Katmoko Arisambodo, Bapak Asdep Percepatan Transformasi Digital ASN dari Kementerian Pan-RB. Kita sapa dulu Pak Ari. Assalamualaikum Pak Ari. Selamat malam Pak Ari.
Waalaikumsalam Mbak Nanda.
Oke, terima kasih Pak Ari sudah berkenan untuk bergabung bersama kami meskipun secara virtual. Pak Ari ini sedang gala dinner ya Pak Ari dengan para JPT di lingkungan Kemenpan RB dan beberapa kementerian lain, tapi mau berkenan meluangkan waktunya bersama kami. Sebagaimana tadi sudah disampaikan MC Bapak bahwa kami sudah menjaring, udah cek ombak dulu nih Pak. Kira-kira PT Pers ini dan teman-teman yang hadir di ruang ballroom ini kira-kira boleh di-share kembali Mbak pertanyaannya tadi di Mentimeters dalam konteks transformasi digital. Menurut PT Pers kebijakan apa yang diperlukan untuk pengembangan karir ASN di era transformasi digital? Kurang lebih nih Pak Ari, informasinya mereka membayangkan ke depan ada peningkatan kompetensi. Mungkin perlu digali lagi nanti Pak pada saat sesi diskusi, apakah peningkatan kompetensi ini terkait dengan transformasi digitalnya kah? Atau memang melalui transformasi digital ini menjadi tools atau sarana kita untuk melakukan pengembangan kompetensi. Nah untuk itu nanti teman-teman bisa menyimak bersama pemaparan dari narasumber kita yang luar biasa ini Bapak Dr. Insinyur Ari, dan juga teman-teman bisa menyampaikan pertanyaannya melalui link Slido yang juga sudah kami siapkan dan teman-teman bisa akses melalui link Slido. Ya, link Slido-nya ke slido.com dengan memasukkan kode 2199522 gitu ya Pak Ari ya. Nanti pertanyaan yang relevan yang terpilih oleh kami nanti akan kami bacakan atau kami persilahkan untuk bertanya langsung kepada narasumber kita dan nanti akan direspon oleh Pak Ari memberikan informasinya dan juga mohon ditanggapi Pak wawasan yang sudah kita temukan tadi terkait transformasi digital bagi ASN apakah sudah benar, apakah Pak Ari nanti akan bercerita sedikit apakah seperti di Jasa Marga tuh Pak yang tadinya banyak penerima gerbang tol gitu kan sekarang dengan adanya e-tol apakah nanti memang beberapa jabatan ASN ke depan itu yang seperti apa yang masih eksis dan yang seperti apa yang mungkin akan perlu ditata ulang dengan adanya transformasi digital. Tidak berpanjang kata lagi, kita bersama mempersilahkan ke Pak Ari untuk menyampaikan paparannya. Kita beri aplaus dulu untuk kita semua bisa semangat menyimak paparan dari Pak Ari. Waktu saya berikan kepada Pak Ari kurang lebih 30 menit ya Pak. Makasih, silakan Pak.
Baik, terima kasih. Sudah nampak ini paparan kami Bu?
Sudah Pak, kan Pak.
Baik, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat malam Mbak Nanda, Bu Nanda, Bapak Ibu sekalian, peserta simposium. Salam sejahtera, salam sehat bagi kita semuanya. Izinkan saya Ari dari Kementerian Pan-RB. Mungkin di malam yang berbahagia ini kita akan coba menyampaikan beberapa hal yang mungkin nanti menjadi bahan diskusi kita bersama. Mungkin secara global akan kami sampaikan nanti apa yang kondisi terkini, perkembangan secara global seperti apa di dunia global, kemudian mungkin akan sedikit kami kaitkan dengan apa yang menjadi kebijakan-kebijakan terkait dengan pembangunan SDM operator dalam menghadapi era 4.0 di Indonesia saat ini. Baik, kita mulai saja mungkin Bapak Ibu sekalian, bahwa kalau kita lihat tapi sebetulnya perkembangan industri saat ini dan juga learning, kaitannya dengan pembelajaran Bapak Ibu sekalian, bahwa kalau kita lihat memang ada perkembangan era dari nol, kemudian era industri 1, industri 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, dan sekarang menjelang ke 5.0. Kalau kita lihat Bapak Ibu sekalian, di era poin 1 itu mechanical ya, mesin uap dan sebagainya, kemudian di-trigger oleh mesin uap dan sebagainya, kemudian di 2 itu elektrik, ya, listrik dan sebagainya, ditemukan listrik. Di era ketiga itu ada ditemukannya dengan komputer dan juga otomatisasi. Kemudian di era 4 itu di-trigger oleh ditemukannya internet dan smartphone, yang kemudian karakteristiknya adalah digitalization. Ya. Kemudian di era kelima yang akan kita juga sebentar lagi mungkin juga sudah masuk, Bapak Ibu sekalian, adalah di-trigger oleh adanya artificial intelligence, kecerdasan buatan yang dikarakteristikkan sebagai rekombinasi. Dan kalau kita lihat Bapak Ibu sekalian, kalau kita kaitkan dengan learning, ya transformasi learning dari masa ke masa tersebut, dari era ke era tersebut, kalau kita lihat di era poin 1.0 itu dulu, mungkin karakteristiknya lebih dititik beratkan bagaimana proses pembelajaran itu untuk mendukung proses produksi secara besar-besaran, secara cepat, dan lain sebagainya. Kemudian di era poin 2 itu standarisasi, diutamakan pada standarisasi, sehingga kemudian di situ timbullah SDM-SDM yang kemudian terstandarisasi, harus memenuhi suatu syarat tertentu, kemudian kalau tidak maka dia akan ketinggalan, dan sebagainya. Dan pola pembelajaran di secara formal juga digalakkan menurut pola seperti itu, kurikulum yang sangat rigid seperti itu ya. Kemudian kalau kita lihat bergeser ke 3.0 itu cenderung karakteristiknya adalah spesialisasi, cenderung ke suatu spesialisasi tertentu, expertise gitu, kemudian memecahkan suatu masalah yang sangat mendalam. Sedangkan di era poin 4.0 itu sebetulnya adalah kolaborasi, titik beranjak kolaborasi, kemudian toolsetnya itu sudah berbagai macam, internet, mungkin kita juga saat ini banyak melihat lah anak-anak kita juga sangat mahir ya, milenial itu sangat mahir untuk menemukan berbagai macam informasi yang kemudian juga berkolaborasi melalui media sosial, media pembelajaran dan sebagainya secara daring dan lain sebagainya. Jadi tidak lagi apa yang kemudian spesialisasi itu dititik beratkan di situ. Dan kalau kemudian kita lihat di 5.0 itu eranya sudah ke machine learning, artificial intelligence, big data dan sebagainya. Kemudian sangat cepat perubahannya. Kalau kita lihat dari 1.0 ke 2.0 itu mungkin jalannya hampir setengah abad atau 1 abad ya, mungkin 1,5 abad. Tapi kemudian 2.0 ke 3 itu 25 tahunan, 3.0 keempat itu mungkin nggak sampai 15 tahun, 4.0 ke 5 itu juga sangat cepat, Bapak sekalian, semakin cepat kalau kita lihat jangka waktunya. Maka kemudian kita lihat bahwa karakteristik yang saat ini berbagai macam toolset yang ada itu sangat cepat berubah, sehingga yang diperlukan adalah bagaimana seseorang itu beradaptasi dengan kondisi teknologi yang berkembang. Kemudian kalau kita lihat Bapak sekalian, kita kondisi jabatan ya, mungkin job ya, kalau di pergeseran itu juga terjadi. Kalau di kondisi-kondisi yang sebelumnya atau mungkin sampai saat ini juga, bahwa kita job itu lebih terkotak-kotak, terdefinisi sangat jelas, predefined gitu ya. Tapi kemudian ke kondisi kedepannya itu lebih ke customized ya, jadi tidak lagi terlalu terkotak-kotak, bisa berpindah, kemudian secara agile berkolaborasi satu sama lain. Kemudian kalau kita lihat yang fokusnya adalah di pengetahuan yang di masa saat ini, tapi ke depan ada tadi sampaikan bagaimana seseorang itu bisa melakukan atau mengakomodasi bagaimana dia bisa learning secara adaptif learning ya. Kemudian juga tadi silo dan rigid kalau saat sebelumnya atau sampai saat ini, ke depannya itu lebih kolaboratif dan fleksibel. Itu kira-kira kalau kita lihat kaitan antara era industri dan learning yang ada. Dan ini kalau kita lihat Bapak sekalian, apa yang kemudian kita butuhkan ya, perkembangan ya dari waktu ke waktu, dari zaman ke zaman terkait dengan pekerjaan jabatan, bahwa di masa lampau mungkin terlalu rigid kita menentukan harus bekerja dari jam 9 ke 5 sore, tapi ke depan akan work anytime. Dan itu mungkin Kementerian PANRB juga lagi mengkaji untuk terkait dengan flexible working arrangement. Kemudian juga bekerja, kalau sebelumnya bekerja mungkin strict di office ya, di perkantoran menggunakan device yang tertentu, tapi kedepannya kita paham bahwa apalagi diamplifikasi dengan COVID, itu bisa bekerja kapanpun dengan menggunakan device apapun. Kemudian juga selama ini pada input, seperti misalnya kalau terkait suatu jabatan tertentu barangkali rigid ya, kualifikasi pendidikannya harus ini dan sebagainya, itu kalau di ASN. Kedepannya kita akan coba tidak terlalu rigid seperti itu, tapi justru bagaimana fokusnya ke outputnya. Jadi bagaimana seseorang itu bisa menghasilkan output sesuai dengan ekspektasi. Kemudian kalau sebelumnya itu menaiki karir itu istilahnya tertentu gitu dengan satu jalur tertentu dan ditentukan oleh barangkali oleh atasan dan oleh organisasi, tapi kedepannya bisa ditentukan oleh diri sendiri. Bagaimana kemudian dia mendrive kedepannya dia seperti apa. Dan selanjutnya adalah pekerjaan-pekerjaan yang selama ini itu sangat rigid ya, misalnya jabatan fungsional kita juga sangat rigid, terkotak-kotak. Kedepannya saya akan sampaikan bahwa kemudian kita akan menuju ke customized work ya, jadi tidak lagi rigid, bisa agile ya, dan juga kita lebih mementingkan bagaimana seseorang nilai dari seseorang itu untuk menduduki suatu jabatan. Kemudian informasi yang selama ini biasanya dikekep ya, dijaga sendiri, tidak terlalu banyak di-sharing, ke depan justru yang terjadi adalah bagaimana kita informasi semakin terbuka, semakin kita men-share orang lain, semakin pintar kita dan seterusnya. Kemudian barangkali juga selama ini tidak banyak bersuara, tapi justru yang ke depan adalah yang dibutuhkan bagaimana seseorang itu menjadi leader, kemudian juga terkait dengan teknologinya sendiri, email. Kalau ke depan lebih ke kolaborasi teknologi. Mungkin saat ini juga sudah kita rasakan ya, media sosial ataupun WhatsApp dan sebagainya itu mungkin lebih digunakan daripada menggunakan email yang ada. Kemudian juga tadi kami sampaikan kalau yang sebelumnya adalah fokus pada knowledge ya, pengetahuan yang sangat mendalam, tapi ke depannya karena perkembangan teknologi yang sangat cepat, bergerak sangat cepat, kemudian yang dibutuhkan adalah bagaimana seseorang itu menjadi adaptive learning. Dan tadi kita sebagai ASN juga harus mempermudah ya seseorang itu untuk bagaimana melakukan learning dari kapanpun, dimanapun, dengan cara apapun. Kalau kita lihat Bapak Ibu sekalian, kita memiliki tantangan yang cukup berat ya secara global juga, bahwa memang nanti ada 85 jutaan ya, pekerjaan-pekerjaan akan hilang dari dunia. Dan pekerjaan-pekerjaan itu sifatnya yang sangat administratif, ya, seperti mungkin data entry, sifatnya administratif, kemudian yang memeriksa, yang sifatnya repetitif dan sebagainya, itu mungkin akan tergerus dengan teknologi. Tapi di sisi lain ada 97 juta yang kemudian akan tumbuh pekerjaan-pekerjaan baru yang memang dibutuhkan pada zaman sekarang, misalnya data analis, kemudian AI, artificial intelligence, big data, marketing, digital, yang kemudian otomatisasi termasuk digital transformation spesialis dan sebagainya, information security, IoT dan sebagainya. Ini yang harus kita lihat juga, bahwa dan kita sudah tidak bisa menarik mundur terhadap perkembangan dunia saat ini. Dan selanjutnya kalau kita lihat juga terdapat transformasi di sisi organisasi sendiri, Bapak Ibu sekalian, kalau kita lihat ya. Jadi ini saya. Jadi kalau kita lihat saat ini cenderung organisasi tersebut piramid ya, secara piramid, kemudian dari atas turun ya, dari leader turun ke secara top down ke employee. Tapi kedepannya kita leader berada di bawah di piramid terbalik, kemudian dia akan empower, ya, mensupport dan empower bagaimana kedepannya itu employee itu bisa berkembang dengan berbagai macam latar belakang, kemudian kemampuan dan sebagainya, dan kemudian membawa misi dari organisasi tersebut. Dan ini juga akan mendorong pergerakan mindset shift dari satu organisasi. Kalau tadinya mungkin sangat berorientasi pada profit, kedepannya lebih ke tujuan, purpose. Kemudian tadi disampaikan bahwa selama ini hierarki, top down dan sebagainya, tapi kedepannya adalah ke network, ke jaringan yang dipentingkan. Kemudian dikontrol dengan sangat ketat, tapi kedepannya adalah empower, mendayakan. Kemudian dari perencanaan-perencanaan yang sangat rigid saat ini, tapi kedepannya adalah ke experimentation, tapi kemudian bisa agile terhadap situasi perkembangan yang kemudian terjadi. Dan tadinya ke privacy, tapi kedepannya lebih ke transparansi. Baik, selanjutnya apa yang disebut leadership jika terjadi pergeseran, terjadi transformasi juga. Dan kita lihat juga kalau kita lihat ada beberapa hal yang perlu diperhatikan untuk leadership ini ke depannya. Pertama adalah bagaimana merencanakan suatu performance ya, setting dari goal, dari tujuan, dari rencana tersebut harus didefinisikan, didiskusikan, kemudian diklarifikasikan kalau seorang leader itu mengklarifikasikan kepada staffnya, kepada bawahannya dan sebagainya. Kemudian tidak lupa pula perlu di coaching ya, coaching day to day. Kemudian seluruh staff itu juga harus mendapat atensi untuk meningkatkan performance. Dan yang paling penting di sini juga kita yang kita akan kembangkan ke depan adalah bagaimana kita melakukan ongoing performance ya, bukan kemudian penilaian seperti misalnya SKP saat ini itu di akhir ya, setelah setahun dia melakukan pekerjaan kemudian baru nilai, tidak seperti itu, tapi kita mungkin kedepannya adalah bagaimana kita menjaga performance itu dari awal gitu. Termasuk kalau di tengah-tengah jalan kemudian ada perlu penyesuaian, itu leader bisa melakukan perubahan, juga memberikan feedback kalau dia memang berprestasi, dan juga kalau kurang ya mungkin bisa mengingatkan itu. Kemudian juga melakukan evaluasi performance, kemudian juga harus mendorong job dan karir development bagi staffnya. Kemudian juga kita lihat bahwa tantangan leadership ini ke depan juga semakin semakin berat. Kalau kita lihat ada beberapa hal yang memang dibutuhkan selain juga passion, sama juga ketangguhan seorang leader. Gambar ini menggambarkan bahwa seorang leader harus mampu mendorong staffnya untuk mendaki gunung yang mungkin tidak mudah untuk didaki. Kemudian juga tadi selain tangguh juga pemikir terhadap sistem, jadi dia bisa mengerti big picture-nya seperti apa, kemudian melakukan jalan keluarnya. Kemudian juga memiliki kejujuran, memberikan solusi, dan juga memberikan informasi yang benar, dan juga menyadari bagaimana dia harus tadi mengembangkan pengetahuan dan mengempower juga dari potensi-potensi yang ada di organisasinya, dan harus memberikan empati. Dan selanjutnya kalau kita lihat Indonesia saat ini memang sangat berpotensi untuk menjadi 4 besar dunia, dan ini kalau kita lihat ini juga mungkin Bapak Ibu sebagian besar mungkin malah seluruhnya ya, KTP itu memang jabatan fungsional di ASN, jadi harapannya juga menjadi kesejahteraan bagi kita semua ASN. Kemudian juga kalau kita lihat pembangunan SDM itu juga sudah menjadi prioritas Bapak Ibu sekalian untuk Pak Presiden di 2019 sampai 2024. Selain itu juga ada pembangunan infrastruktur, simplifikasi regulasi, penyederhanaan birokrasi, dan transformasi ekonomi. Kalau kami sebetulnya di Kementerian PAN-RB sangat erat terkait dengan pembangunan SDM dan penyederhanaan birokrasi. Baik, kemudian kalau kita lihat ini ada dilema yang mungkin kita gambarkan mungkin cukup ekstrim mungkin ya, seperti itu. Jadi ke depan kita memang ingin menarik Bapak Ibu sekalian, gerbong ini birokrasi ini menjadi profesional dan berkelas dunia, termasuk kemudian kita sudah canangkan terkait dengan berakhlak, bahwa suatu ASN itu profesional yang memiliki orientasi pelayanan, akuntabel, kompeten, harmonis, loyal, adaptif, dan kolaboratif. Tapi di sisi lain Bapak Ibu sekalian kita pahami bersama bahwa memang ada berbagai permasalahan yang muncul yang kemudian menarik ke belakang ini, tarik tambangnya. Jadi memang beberapa yang harus kita akui juga bahwa memang masih banyak terjadi KKN, kecurangan misalnya jual beli jabatan, kemudian masalah non ASN ini honorer yang saat ini juga di data ternyata penyelesaian honorer dan sebagainya itu menjadi masalah nasional, datanya cukup besar, sampai hari ini mungkin di atas 2 juta, yang semakin hari semakin sulit untuk kemudian kita selesaikan. Kemudian juga ada ASN yang sebagian besar masih di zona nyaman, takut perubahan, sistem anggaran yang lemah, kesejahteraan ASN yang menjadi tidak terperhatikan, kemudian juga ada unsur politisasi dari ASN tersebut. Dan kalau kita lihat ini tarik tambang yang satu narik ke sana, ke belakang, ke depan, ini ke belakang, sama-sama berkeringat, tapi sebetulnya kalau kita lihat indikator penting itu kurang begitu bergerak, kurang begitu misalnya indikator pelayanan publik walaupun ada peningkatan, tapi mungkin ya itu tadi ada beberapa masalahan, kemudian efektivitas pemerintahan, global competitiveness, dan global talent index itu juga masih perlu kita tingkatkan. Dan kita juga mengalami teknologi yang VUCA, kemudian dengan triple disruption, itu yang pertama adalah sisi teknologi, disrupsi teknologi dengan berbagai macam teknologi yang ada, kemudian juga milenial ya. Jadi kalau kita lihat bahwa tantangan kita juga memiliki modal yang besar yang harus kemudian juga harus kita manfaatkan dari kemampuan dari demografi tersebut untuk menjadi hal yang positif ke depannya. Dan yang ketiga adalah disrupsi yang dikombo diamplifikasi juga oleh COVID-19. Dan ini mungkin saya nggak akan terlalu sampaikan detail. Kalau kita lihat saat ini Bapak Ibu sekalian, sebaran ASN kita memang cukup besar ya, sekitar 4,2 juta, 4,3, ini ada yang sudah ASN dan juga ada P3K. Kemudian namun demikian kalau kita lihat ini dari ASN tersebut sekitar 39% atau sekitar 1,55 juta ya, itu adalah di jabatan pelaksana gitu, yang mainly secara utama kebanyakan adalah merupakan jabatan-jabatan yang sifatnya administratif gitu. Dan kemudian tadi terdisrupsi, akan rentan sangat disrupsi, dan kemudian karena perkembangan teknologi dan sebagainya itu sangat-sangat untuk rentan ya kaitannya ini. Dan memang ini tantangan besar bagi kita untuk meningkatkan bagaimana ASN ini ke depannya menjadi lebih diberdaya gunakan, dan kemudian bagaimana juga mereka bisa berkontribusi lebih dengan berbagai macam mungkin barangkali jabatan-jabatan fungsional yang ada saat ini. Dan kalau kita lihat tadi yang tenaga yang sifatnya administratif tersebut, kalau kita kaitkan dengan AI, maka kemudian sangat-sangat mungkin untuk tergerus, karena AI itu pada dasarnya dari waktu ke waktu semakin berkembang dan bisa menyelesaikan dengan berbagai macam permasalahan, misalnya yang sifatnya repetitif, pekerjaan-pekerjaan yang sifatnya repetitif, atau kemudian sangat kompleks yang sangat ini dengan big data dan sebagainya, dan kemudian juga yang kekurangan expert ya, kekurangan tenaga ahli, misalnya untuk menjawab pertanyaan dengan chatbot dan sebagainya, dan saat ini kan sudah sangat lazim, itu juga sedikit banyak akan bisa menggeser tadi tenaga-tenaga yang sifatnya administratif. Baik, kemudian kalau kita lihat, ini tadi saya sampaikan bahwa kita butuh arahan Pak Presiden secara khusus terkait dengan reformasi birokrasi ke Menteri kami yang Pak Soranas yang baru ini, baru menjabat beberapa bulan ini, adalah terkait dengan yang pertama adalah birokrasi yang berdampak, yang kemudian bisa dirasakan langsung oleh masyarakat. Kemudian reformasi birokrasi bukan hanya sekedar tumpukan kertas, kemudian birokrasi harus lincah, agile, dan cepat. Dan kalau kita lihat apa yang kemudian kita prioritaskan Bapak Ibu sekalian, saat ini ada 7 yang kemudian Pak Menteri menerjemahkan arahan tersebut. Pertama adalah pemangkasan proses bisnis, layanan kepegawaian yang kemudian akan berdampak pada jutaan ASN. Jadi kita sedang berkolaborasi untuk dengan BKN juga, karena bisnis layanan kepegawaian ini sebagian besar ada di BKN. Kemudian penerapan reformasi birokrasi tematik pada 4 klaster prioritas. Kemudian yang ketiga adalah transformasi profesionalisme ASN berbasis digital, meliputi penyederhanaan birokrasi dan jabatan fungsional, dan tadi penataan tenaga non-ASN, honorer. Kemudian akselerasi pembentukan mall pelayanan publik, MPP dan juga MPP digital di seluruh Indonesia. Penguatan SPPE, sistem pemerintahan berbasis elektronik. Kemudian percepatan penyusunan kebijakan kelembagaan, tata kelola dana ASN menuju IKN Nusantara dan daerah otonomi baru Papua. Dan yang terakhir adalah transformasi sistem pendidikan ASN mendukung percepatan reformasi birokrasi yang tematik. Kita ini tadi kalau roadmap dari pengelolaan SDM aparatur, kita menuju yang birokrasi berkelas dunia, dan kita mulai tinggalkan apa yang disebut dengan rule based birokrasi yang terlalu rigid dengan aturan dan sebagainya, menjadi dynamic governance yang lebih mengutamakan bagaimana pengembangan potensi human capital ke depan. Dan khususnya kami di Kementerian PAN-RB dan di Bidang SDM aparatur, sebenarnya ada tiga jenis transformasi yang kita dorong percepatannya dari transformasi organisasi, ini dengan berbagai macam kebijakan di layering isolasi, kemudian juga membentuk bagaimana organisasi yang agile, fleksibel, dan kolaboratif. Kemudian kalau di sisi sistem kerjanya dengan berbagai macam proses digitalisasi, baik itu di digitalisasi pelayanan publik maupun digitalisasi proses bisnis pemerintah, dan transformasi SDM aparatur sendiri, khususnya kami di Kementerian SDM aparatur, itu setidaknya ada 6 strategi yang kemudian kita kita dorong bersama. Pertama adalah di penguatan budaya kerja dan employer branding, kemudian percepatan peningkatan kapasitas SDM aparatur, peningkatan kinerja dan sistem penghargaan, pengembangan talenta dan karir, dan kemudian percepatan transformasi digital, perancangan jabatan, perencanaan dan pengadaan. Kemudian kami sendiri sebetulnya saya saat ini amanati untuk menduduki sebagai percepatan asisten di percepatan transformasi digital. Baik, Bapak Ibu sekalian, ini kalau saya sedikit ulang, bagaimana yang penguatan budaya kerja dan employer branding ini, seperti kita ketahui bahwa sudah di-launching oleh Pak Presiden juga di 27 Juli 2021 berakhlak. Saya kira mungkin Bapak Ibu sekalian sudah banyak tersosialisasi terkait dengan hal ini. Kemudian juga yang kedua adalah terkait bagaimana yang kebijakan yang kedua di peningkatan kapasitas SDM aparatur. Ini setidaknya ada beberapa hal yang kemudian kita dorong Bapak Ibu sekalian. Pertama adalah bagaimana kita ingin membentuk tadi apa yang disebut dengan integrated learning. Jadi sekarang kan kita tidak lagi menerapkan pada training-training yang kemudian formal seperti itu. Justru kita akan memperluas berbagai macam bentuk learning tadi ke ASN secara keseluruhan. Bagaimana kemudian kita mengintegrasikan learning dengan kerjaan yang nanti mungkin modelnya adalah di 70-20-10 ya. Jadi 10% itu adalah di yang formal learning yang ada di kelas dan sebagainya. Kemudian 70 itu adalah yang di tempat kerja, dan 20 itu yang kemudian akan menggunakan pekerjaan yang sifatnya mentoring. Jadi bekerja dengan didampingi mentor, coaching, dan sebagainya. Di tempat kerja itu yang mungkin persentase anjurnya di 20. Kemudian selain itu kita juga akan mengintegrasikan berbagai macam learning, ya, institusi learning yang ada di berbagai kementerian, lembaga, dan daerah, termasuk nanti bagaimana kita bersama-sama dengan LAN untuk bekerja untuk ini. Kemudian Bapak-Ibu sekalian, untuk yang total reward ini mungkin saya sampaikan sedikit ya. Jadi ada peningkatan kinerja dan sistem penghargaan. Kalau kita lihat, memang tadi kami sampaikan juga bahwa trennya ke depan adalah bagaimana kemudian kinerja itu ada yang dilakukan adalah ongoing performance ya. Jadi bukan sekedar evaluasi kinerja di akhir saja. Karena mungkin sudah terlalu terlambat kalau kemudian kita lakukan penilaian kinerja setelah sesuatunya dilakukan. Dan ini gambaran pola umumnya, siklusnya adalah bagaimana di Permenpan yang sudah ditetapkan, mungkin kan ASN juga sudah tersosialisasi terkait ini, Permenpan 6 tahun 2022. Siklusnya adalah di penetapan dan klarifikasi ekspektasi, kemudian pengembangan kinerja pegawai melalui ongoing feedback, kemudian evaluasi kinerja dan pemberian penghargaan berdasarkan kinerja pegawai. Dan nanti Bapak-Ibu sekalian, ujungnya salah satu yang kemudian dilakukan adalah penilaian kinerja berdasarkan dua sumbu ini. Yang pertama adalah sumbu di hasil kerja, itu di sumbu Y, dan perilaku berakhlaknya di sumbu X. Gitu. Jadi kemudian kita bagikan menjadi 9 box, 9 kuadran, sangat baik di kanan atas, kemudian ada baik di situ. Kemudian kalau kinerja hasil kerjanya rendah tapi perilakunya bagus, barangkali butuh perbaikan. Sebaliknya kalau hasil kerjanya tinggi tapi perilakunya yang kurang bagus, maka kita nilai sebagai kurang atau misconduct. Sedangkan kalau kemudian semuanya kurang, ya menjadi mungkin harus ada perlakuan khusus untuk ASN yang berada di kuadran kiri. Garis besar perubahan nanti macam inisiatif di yang kemudian bisa didapatkan oleh pekerja tersebut apabila memang saat ini kita lagi menggodok berbagai macam regulasi untuk mendukung